philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Policing the huge expanse of Northern Ontario is complex and expensive. Tonight, why some cities there want a new deal to cover the costs of the OPP in their communities. Then, novelist Eva Stachniak talks to Jayan Jagannathan about the lessons of war that refugees carry. And from the countries that continue to stand with Russia despite the war in Ukraine to Ontario's 2022 budget, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, April 29th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. The OPP, Ontario Provincial Police, work across this province out of 165 detachments. In many smaller communities, they are the local police force. And for some northern cities and towns, the cost of that has become a big problem. With us now to explain, in the Northwestern Ontario community of Sioux Lookout, Mayor Doug Lawrence and Darlene Ange-Koneb, Board Chair of the Sioux Lookout Police Services Board. And about 200 kilometers south of there, in Fort Frances, Ontario, Mayor of the City of Kenora, Daniel Reynard. Hello to you all.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Looking forward to this conversation because I think this isn't something that we've been hearing a lot in the media as we approach the election. Just to set up our conversation, the municipalities of Kenora, Pickle Lake, and Sioux Lookout have agreed to form a coalition to address the cost of policing in your communities. Mayor Reynard, how did this coalition come to be?
Well, what's happened over the years is we've attacked the problem individually. Municipality of Sioux Lookout has they reached out to us and suggested that we work collectively. And when we went through it, it just seemed like the best case scenario. We were the three outliers. We were the three communities that, are way above the provincial averages. So it just made more sense that we work together.
And Mayor Lawrence, what are some of your concerns?
Well, the high policing cost per property is the primary concern. We've been working for 8 years with the province on that. It's as Mayor Reynard said, we are outliers in the province in terms of cost by factors of 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 times on the cost per property. The policing formula the cost formula needs to be addressed to unburden outlier communities such as Pickle Lake, Kenora, and Sioux Lookout.
That is a huge difference. Sheldon, if you could bring this board up, I'm just going to read a little bit. It says the three municipalities estimate that the cost of police services has taken $30 million more from their communities than they should have had to pay. Darlene, the media release stated that the three communities have the highest OPP costs in Ontario. Where does the high policing costs come from?
I believe the high policing costs may come from the number of calls for service. I think that's so far what I know anyway. And because our police detachment also serves some First Nation communities, not just Sioux Lookout, so there are high costs to the travel and the cost of anything up north is more than what the cost is in the south.
And Mayor Lawrence, I'm guessing that money could go to other things that are desperately needed in those municipalities?
Absolutely. And I'd just like to add to what Darlene said about the calls for service. All three of our communities act as hub communities for First Nation communities. In fact, between Kenora, Pickle Lake, and Sioux Lookout, we're the primary service hub for 33%, 1/3 of the 133 First Nations in Ontario. That is the hub nature is huge. When you think about a hub, Sioux Lookout is a hub for 33 First Nations, and they fly in and out of our community. We're the busiest airport in the world is Atlanta, and the per capita as a hub, the per capita flights in and out of Atlanta, 75 million for 6 million, or 12.5 per capita per year for the base population. Toronto plus the island airport is 8. Sioux Lookout is 30. Passenger movements per year per capita base population. Kenora and Pickle Lake are hubs in their own way. So that really is driving the policing costs and the calls for service, as Darlene said, in our municipalities.
And Mayor Renard, Mayor Lawrence mentioned the fact that these communities are hubs, meaning, I guess, that people from other communities are coming into your municipalities and accessing those services. The province introduced the OPP cost formula in 2015, which has been working for certain cities and towns. But what makes it ineffective for your municipalities?
It's interesting that you point out that it works. The current formula does work for the majority of communities that receive OPP policing. Our 3 communities, the reasons why our costs are so high, they're driven by calls for service. And again, as Mayor Lawrence pointed out, people come into our communities for healthcare, for the court system. There's so many reasons why they come in, and it creates. We've got this a formula that's based on per household, but our population is actually far exceeds the number of people that this formula is based on, the households it's based on. So when you start getting an example would be our calls for service are based on, they take the total for the province and then they allocate those costs based on your calls for service. So for the entire province, we pay 2.74% of all the calls for service. Our calls for service come out well over $600 per household. The provincial average for the entire bill for most municipalities is at just over the $300 range. So that's what really drives the 3 of our costs exceedingly is the calls for service. And that's what, again, what I use the word outliers. That's what pushes us so far above the norm.
And Darlene?
Yes, just to give you an idea, here in Sioux Lookout, the hub, as we call it, there are about 33, 34, I think, First Nations in the area. So they come here for health services, dental services, or whatever, optometrist services. They also come here for education. The kids come here for school. And so we have a lot of people who are moving through Sioux Lookout, not necessarily living here sometimes, but coming here for a short time. And we cover Treaty 3, Treaty 9, Treaty 5 areas. And I'm sure in Kenora they have about the same number, probably about 28 communities that come through their city. So that's just to give you an idea of the number of First Nation communities that are being served by some of these areas, including Pickle Lake. Yeah.
Well, we reached out to the Office of the Solicitor General on this issue, and they've given us a statement as response. I'd like to read that. They write, "We are currently reviewing court security costs, including the costs of transportation, which are among costs billed to municipalities. Notably, when implemented in 2015, the current billing model brought costs down for municipalities. For all 3 municipalities detailed in the media release, the costs under the previous billing model were higher than the current estimated policing costs for 2022. Mayor Lawrence, I want to come to you. How would you respond to that? What's the outcome that you're hoping to get from the province?
Well, what the Solicitor General's office said is in part true, that when they introduced the new police cost model for OPP municipalities in 2015, it brought up the cost for some municipalities as a base cost, which is about 50% of most municipalities' bill, which is $178 per property. And then the next biggest cost for us is calls for service. There are court security costs, prisoner transportation costs, and some other miscellaneous costs. But the calls for service for Kenora, Pickle Lake, and Sioux Lookout are disproportionately higher. They're by a factor of, on the calls for service alone, it's 3-4 times higher than an average municipality. So there needs to be a discount of some kind for hub communities such as ourselves. It's an unfair burden to the tax base that we have.
Mayor Reynard, Mayor Lawrence just said it's an unfair tax burden to the people who are paying these taxes. How do you respond to the response that we had from the Solicitor General?
Well, when the Solicitor General's office, let's be right up front here. The system works except for our 3 municipalities. So what we're looking for is an equitable system. When the quote about the costs dropped down, but since that time, our costs have been driven up because of these high costs of service. And I'll give you an example of the financial impact of the city of Kenora. Our total tax levy, the money we generate from our municipal tax bill, is just over $28 million. We pay out to the OPP $6.7 million. That represents 25%. 1 in every $4 that we collect goes to the provincial police. If we were at a fair and equitable system where they found a way to, don't change the system, just find a way to make it equitable for our 3 communities. That if we were at the provincial average, we would bring in the $4 million that would go out to the OPP. That portion would go into, fixing our roads. We have 17 bridges, and 8 of them that were downloaded through the provincial downloading. We can take those dollars and move them into services that support and enhance our community.
You've said that, you've mentioned it twice now, that the system doesn't work the way it is for your municipalities, and you've called yourselves outliers. What do you think that the province isn't understanding when we do talk about what's happening in your communities? Mayor Lawrence?
I think they do understand. I think it can be difficult for the province to make a change. This is the billing act came in 2015. They don't need to change that. They need to change just perhaps the regulation that provides the discount. I think they do understand, but we go down there, and that's why as individual municipalities from the far north, we would go down and speak to the Solicitor General's office, and we've done that. I've done that with our staff probably 20 times over the 8 years, and explain things and how they don't work. But then we leave, and we're just one municipality out of 300 and over 300 that are policed by the OPP, as is Kenora and Pickle Lake. So that's in part why we formed a coalition to try and get some action from the Solicitor General's office, because we are outliers in the extreme, and it's only increasing over time. The population, as we act for a hub community for that all of us do, is the most marginalized population by any determination on social determinants of health in the province, and the amount of movement and outmigration from the First Nations for healthcare, for education, for retail, for everything, and for the court system, for the justice system, is only increasing over time. The northern airports were really only opened largely in the 1990s with scheduled flights. The passenger movements in and out are increasing over time, and the province needs to recognize this and the impact that has on our communities.
Darlene, let's take a look. I want to take a look at another community in Northern Ontario, Thunder Bay. The region has been at the center of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children. Recently, First Nations leaders in Thunder Bay were calling for the OPP to provide oversight of municipal policing services on reinvestigation of unsolved cases. Darlene, is there a similar pattern of broken trust between Indigenous communities and police in your community?
I don't think so. We don't have many comments that come in with regards to complaints about the police services here and the missing and murdered. Basically, we have a FILO office here, which is goes into investigating and has reopened one of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that is an Indigenous led office out of the Ministry of the Attorney General. Mm-hmm. And so the missing and murdered, there is work being done in this area and around Kenora. So we don't see too many complaints about the police services board here, not like in what's happening in Thunder Bay. I'm not commenting on that.
You don't want to, I don't want to put you in a position where you feel uncomfortable, for sure. May Renard, what have you been hearing from Indigenous communities in your community?
Well, I don't want to pretend that we don't have issues, but there's certainly, ours are much, they're not to the extreme that we hear about what's happening in Thunder Bay or what's been suggested happening in Thunder Bay. The Police Service Board, we have not had a lot of complaints. We actually just worked through our long-term strategic plan. There was a lot of community involvement, a lot of trying to engage with our First Nation communities. So it's not perfect, but it's certainly something that we're working collectively with. We've had a lot of positive projects that we're having one of two missing and murdered Indigenous monuments put up in Kenora this summer. There's a peace park and that's a partnership between our First Nation partners. And so we still have a long way to go, but that's what we're striving for is, we work collectively and we work together.
And Mayor Lawrence, I think Ontario is such a big province, and I believe the last time, if my memory serves me correctly, there's 444 municipalities in this province. So many different places need different things. We're in election season, and we're hearing a lot of different issues being spoken about, depending on the, housing is something that seems to be affecting everybody across the board. But within your municipality, this is something that is affecting I imagine it's having a ripple effect on all the services in your municipalities. In your view, is policing cost an important issue to consider in the upcoming provincial election?
Absolutely. And let's be clear about one thing. This isn't about defunding the police. Unfortunately, our police services, and Darlene indicated, the police in Sulaco, the OPP, work extremely well with all agencies, in part because of all the gaps in services that we have. We have no detox, we have no addictions treatment, supportive housing is limited, drop-in centers, whatever. There's so many gaps here, and the police work very well with them, but it drives the policing costs up through calls for service. And those policing costs are reflected in property tax. We probably have the highest property tax in the region because of our policing costs. And then we're trying to attract people to come here and fill many jobs in the social service sector, in the public sector, in the private sector. And cost of housing is one of the main detriments to moving here. So it goes hand in hand that we were advocate for fair policing costs and to fill in some of the gaps in services that exist in Sulaco, which are now that work is being undertaken by the police.
And Darlene, I saw you nodding.
Yes, I agree. There have been, we've made a lot of efforts to lower some of the costs, but you can only do so much with lessening calls for service. Supportive housing, which is new to Sulaco, has created lessening calls for service. And we work, the police work very well with the other agencies, like Mayor Doug Lawrence has said. We've also worked with the LCBO on closures for Sundays, and I guess it has helped them out too because they had staffing issues. It's hard to find staff for, I believe, any organization across Canada is having that type of problem where staffing is an issue.
And
so there is a lot of work that is being done to try and work with all the agencies as well as the businesses. Yes.
And Mayor Renard, Mayor Lawrence mentioned this isn't about defunding the police. This is about your municipalities paying their fair share. In your view, is policing an important issue to consider in the upcoming provincial election?
Well, I believe it is. Especially in the two ridings. We have two of the largest ridings in Ontario. When you look at Minister Rickford will always talk about how large our riding is in Kenora. In Mayor Lawrence's riding, it's even larger, and the gaps in travel are significant. So the policing, I think one thing I'd really like to reinforce is we are not discouraged or unsatisfied with the level of service we get from the OPP. We have a tremendous relationship. We're very proud of the service. So that's not the issue. The issue is trying to find an equitable balance in terms of what that service costs. So I think as we move forward, definitely when, as the candidates, as the election is called, as the candidates come forward, we're going to make them aware of this unique situation. And, we need their support. The reality is the more support we have, the better chance we have of finding a fair and equitable solution to what we're trying to strive as three communities.
And Mayor Lawrence, you mentioned property taxes. What other areas of services could you use this money if you did get more funding?
Well, if you drove down our roads today, you wouldn't have to ask me that question.
Yeah.
The potholes and the conditions and from the winter are dreadful. Certainly, infrastructure is primary. Recreation planning and programming for sure. We're always tight, and there's a pushback from the residents on high property taxes. We're very dependent on the residential tax base because we have very little industry or commercial activity, so it's really a burden. We have high employment in the public sector, so we have hospitals and schools that pay provincial payment in lieu of tax. So infrastructure would be key. That would be the first place, also to hold the taxes at a reasonable level.
I'm from East Africa, and if you've ever been to Africa, the roads are terrible, and we call it the African massage because it's like, so maybe it's like the northern massage. Darlene, what would you like to see come out of this coalition in our last 2 minutes?
Well, I would like the coalition to be heard at the provincial level, the government of Ontario, and to be brought forward to the candidates in the upcoming election, and for something to be done. That's all, I guess, that can be done for now. We hope the government of Ontario can work with these three communities in the future.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you for spending some time with us. We really do appreciate it, and for sounding the alarm bells on what's happening in your municipalities. We appreciate your time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
War inevitably creates displaced people, refugees, innocent civilians whose lives are turned inside out. As Poland receives millions of Ukrainians fleeing Russia's missiles, novelist Eva Stachniak recalled her own mother's words about how war leaves lasting effects on families. She wrote about that for TVO.org. Eva Stachniak's latest work of historical fiction is The School of Mirrors, and she joins us now from Ontario's capital city. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So in your article for TVO.org, you write, war lingers in families. It is visible in generations of silent men drinking far too much, in women with empty eyes who refuse to talk of the past. What did you mean by that?
Well, I grew up on the ruins of the war. I grew up watching piles of rubble, and no matter what you tell a child who looks at the pile of rubble around you, where you can still see bits and pieces of the old apartments, and then, of course, just mountains of these rubbles around me, nothing can reassure you that you are safe. The only safe thing is the love of your family and of your parents. So I was really always aware of the fact that I grew up on the ruins of the terrible war, and that I will have to understand how to live and how to keep hope and how to survive if that war comes back. You know, I was always terribly aware of the fact that my grandmother lived through 2 world wars. My mother lived through 1 World War and the Nazi occupation and then Stalinist period. And that if I want to be a mother, I will probably have to live through 1 war. And if I want to be a grandmother, then probably 2. So I think that sense a lot of people from Poland and Ukraine and Russia grew up with.
Now, you spent most of your life in Wrocław, Poland. I want to show two photos of you. The first is of you as a child with your mother. This was taken in 1954. And then another photo, this was 2 years later in 1956, with you posing, pushing a carriage. What was it like? Describe to me what it was like growing up in a city that you describe a city of refugees.
Poland, Wrocław was very interesting in that sense because everybody around me was displaced, including my own family. This was the city from which the German population left in 1945, basically fleeing the Red Army. And it is the city into which refugees from former Ukraine and former Soviet Union, central Poland, bombed out cities came. So everyone around me always had a picture, an image of this other home that they have left, including my grandparents. And so you always have a sense of being in the city, living, and also living with the memories of your family that your family has for you, of that other idealized place. So that was the reality. On the other hand, there was a sense of that Wrocław was really not fully Polish, that it was still Breslau, the German city, and that therefore we can be asked to move at any time, or we may be forced to move at any time. So I always had a sense of always being very close to displacement. And when I came to Canada, I realized that being an immigrant is really not very different. I've been an immigrant and a refugee in a sense, or among refugees all my life.
I want to actually talk about your chapter here in Canada. We have a photo of you in Montreal. This is back in 1981. What happened after you got here?
Well, I have to say that I came to Montreal, to McGill, to study at McGill in the English department. And in fact, I also came at the time, sort of 3 months before the martial law was declared in Poland. And that really changed my life because from a foreign student, I became a refugee. I became someone who did not want to go back to Poland because it had tanks in the street, it had martial law, the solidarity was crushed. And there was this sense of heaviness and foreboding of what might happen. We were all expecting a Soviet invasion. It was very, very realistic that we would end up in the place that Ukraine is now. So that also lay very heavily. But at the same time, Canada was just wonderful, wonderful. And that sense of opening, of welcoming the Polish people who were sort of stuck in Canada, extending all sorts of possibilities, legal and just friendly hands, friendly people who would invite me and my family and take care of us in so many ways. So I never forgot it. I think that it was a coming home in some ways, because Canada became home during that first year when I knew I didn't want and couldn't really return to Poland.
I want to show another photo. This is a photo of a tank in Warsaw, same time in 1981, that same year from the previous photo, Poland's capital here. You were separated from your family. You were in Montreal, but the rest of your family were in Poland. How difficult was that?
It was very difficult. It was my son, who was 3.5 at the time when I left, and he and my husband were supposed to come and join me in Montreal. So the martial law meant that they were not able to join me right away. They eventually, luckily, were, but. That particular picture that you showed was what I found on the morning of the 14th of December. That was a picture taken in Warsaw. And I think that, the cinema is called Moscow cinema. The tank in the street suggests, that there is a war, yet another war, that war that I feared as a child that I would have to live through if I wanted to be a mother. And the sense that my family is there, and I didn't really know what it meant. I didn't know whether the government was still ready to let people leave. They finally did, so that wasn't such a big problem, but I wasn't sure of that. I didn't know whether I would have to just pack and go back, or if they would be allowed to leave. So very, very, very difficult time. And, it's something that I see with every wave of refugees. You have stories of people separated and not knowing whether they would ever see the loved ones, or if not the immediate family, then parents, grandparents. That was a very, very difficult situation.
In your article for TVO.org, you make the connection to that time to what's happening right now in Ukraine. How does that situation back then play into what's happening there?
The moment I saw the refugees at the Polish border, Ukrainian refugees, mostly women and children, it was like having this powerful reminder of 1981 for me, and also that sense of I know what they feel. I know the children who are clinging to their parents or to their mothers. I know that they have seen already too much, something that I hope no other generation of children will ever have to. But of course, these are just hopes, because the world has been engulfed in so many conflicts ever since. So my connection to it, to my own memories and to how I felt then and how I know these people feel, and also joy that Poland did what Canada did when I came here, that Poland actually opened up its arms and welcomed the women and the children who were fleeing the war, and that they are living to their promise to help them and to shelter them until the situation is resolved, and the sense of that they are living through what we were saved from in 81. There was no Soviet invasion, luckily. I mean, there was the martial law, and there were the long years of resistance. And that, I think, Ukraine is also will have to face, if the rebuilding, the resistance, the sense of trying not to be weighed down with the heaviness of these losses. So a lot of very personal memories ever since I saw these first pictures.
On that point, how much of your personal experiences inform your works of historical fiction?
I think it's all about that. I mean, I always write about people who are leaving one culture and joining another. I write about how big history affects everyday life, the French Revolution in the School of Mirrors, the fighting in the streets, the great social changes. Yes, they play out in the politics, but they really play out in the families, because the families bear the brunt and the trauma of war. And that trauma lives through generations. So I write about that. I write about people who have to pick up their lives and find something that will give them hope, and how, and not only them, but their children, because you have to raise children with hope and with understanding that there is strength in resistance. There is strength in picking up and leaving and joining another culture, living in another culture. There is strength that is contagious. In a sense, it also, I'm trying to write about how it plays through generations, and with different lives. The Chosen Maiden, in my novel about Brania Nijinsky, in fact, with this book, I spent I spent, in a sense, 1 year with her in Kiev right after the revolution. So my books take me to the very places that I came from. And they help me with my thoughts, and it helped me pass on my experience to Canadian readers and readers in other countries who read my books.
Beautifully said. Eva, thank you so much for sharing your personal story with us, and thank you for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you for having me.
The agenda this week heard from Ontario's Financial Accountability Officer about what taxpayers get for their money, considered how diversity and inclusion training could improve, and looked at why some countries still align with Russia despite war in Ukraine. The agenda's Week in Review begins with Ontario's 2022 budget.
You're a former Bay Street guy, so I'm going to ask you about the numbers. I know you say that you can balance the budget 2 years earlier than was forecast in the last budget. However, the independent financial accountability officer said a week ago that the books were in such good shape you could balance the books by next year if you didn't go on an orgiastic spending spree. Those might be my words as opposed to his, actually. But it looks like you're not planning to balance the books until 2028. And my question is, why so late?
Well, Steve, you're absolutely right. We're going to balance the budget 2 years faster than we thought a year ago. We've made tremendous progress on bringing the debt to GDP down. The deficit has been coming down. But, you know, after 2 years of the pandemic, we have to rebuild Ontario's economy. You know, we've lost in the previous 15 years under the Liberals, we lost all those auto manufacturing jobs. We need to bring those good jobs back, and we're doing exactly that. We're making investments to get bigger paychecks for the people of Ontario. You know, we're building infrastructure. It's a time to build highways, public transit, hospitals, housing, high-speed internet, because things like highways, people don't want to spend time in gridlock, and that costs us $11 billion a year in lost productivity in the greater Golden Horseshoe. You know, we're providing skilled training and retraining and reskilling for our workers and so that they can have the skills to succeed. And of course, we're helping with costs to bring costs down so that the hardworking people of Ontario can have a little extra money in their pockets. And finally, you know, the pandemic really laid bare the previous Liberals' lack of investment and foresight in building hospitals and long-term care. Well, we're building those hospitals, we're building the beds, we're hiring the nurses and the personal support workers, and we're investing in home care. So these are the types of things that I think are very prudent, and we've done it in a fiscally responsible way.
Well, again, as a former Bay Street guy, you would know that the debt to GDP ratio is an important indication of the health of the economy, and you say you're bringing it down. It's going in this fiscal year from 41.4% to 2 years down the road to 41.3%. Now, if you were Peter Bethlen-Falvey still working on Bay Street at DBRS, the Dominion Bond Rating Service, how unimpressed would you be with that kind of fiscal management?
Well, Peter Bethlen-Falvey would be very impressed with the budget, and very impressed with the plan to rebuild the economy. You know, we've got to grow the economy. We've got to grow the pie in this province. And, you know, we've got some of the best workers, the best education system, Steve. We've had to make more investments in the healthcare because the pandemic exposed that the lack of investment over the previous 15 years exposed us to this pandemic. So Premier Ford has made a commitment through the pandemic not to spare any expense. I made that commitment. We're going to continue to make the commitment to spend on infrastructure. We're going to build things. We're going to get things done because that's good for jobs. It's good for bigger paychecks. It's good for people's standard of living, and that's why I think we found the right balance here.
Let me read you a comment that Randall Denley has written. He, the newspaper columnist and a former Conservative candidate, I would add, who said about Premier Ford, he writes this: is he a Liberal kind of guy who knows that people like to be bought with their own money, or is he a leader whose government called eliminating the deficit, quote, a moral imperative back in 2019? Which is it, Treasurer?
We had a pandemic, Steve. You know, this really exposed the lack of investment. We had already started building hospitals, and, you know, we started building subways. I made the commitment a year ago to invest in broadband so we could connect the rest of Ontario, 700,000 households that weren't connected or underserved. You know, we need more schools. You know, and I look at Scarborough as one example that I'd point out. You know, people were talking about building a subway to connect the 700,000 people out in Scarborough in the 1980s. You know, that we need to get cars off the road. We need to build transit. We've got the shovel in the ground building that Scarborough subway. You know, Premier Ford and the team that we've got and the mandate that we're asking for from the people of Ontario will allow us to build this economy, to build that infrastructure, to help people with costs, help workers, and like I said, stay open. So I feel very, very confident and good about our plan, and we're going to get it done.
This budget/platform today really misses the mark. And what is so shocking about it is that even on the front cover of their budget/platform, I mean, there's a large highway, there's smog. It's essentially a highway to unaffordable housing. And if there's anything that we all know, having gone through a really challenging 4 years, but particularly with the pandemic, is that the cost of everything has gone up. So affordability is one of the #1 issues, but housing is a key component of our recovery. And there are so many people right now who find housing unaffordable. And so when the minister talks about, prioritizing Highway 413 and the Bradford bypass, he actually is essentially saying that he's going to push other transit and infrastructure projects down the line. What we struggle with on this decision essentially is that, one, it's bad for the environment. It doesn't meet the needs of the people of the province that we are elected to serve. And they talk broadly about infrastructure, but they don't talk about people.
The budget is not fully costed. He doesn't necessarily know what it's going to cost to build those rails to Timmins. Neither do they have the full cost in place for the Highway 413, which, they're putting that on the cover of their budget. And so highways are mentioned 151 times in this budget. Women are mentioned 8 times. And so you really see where the headspace is at for this government. And, what the Ontario Liberals have said is that we would cancel Highway 413 that paves over farmland and greenbelt and watershed communities, and instead would invest in public education, because we believe that that is aligned with the priorities of the people of this province and, frankly, the needs of the province to set us up for a brighter future. And that's what would be our focus, making class sizes smaller, hiring 16,000 new teachers and education workers, and making sure that the supports are in place for our public education system.
This is a pro-sprawl, anti-climate budget. I mean, it's unbelievable that the government is essentially going to make life more expensive in Ontario and pave over our children's future. I mean, we're facing a climate crisis and a cost of living crisis, and the government's response is to spend a staggering $25 billion to build highways that are going to increase climate pollution, make housing less affordable for people, force people into expensive, long, soul-crushing commutes, pave over the farmland that feeds us, the wetlands that protect us from flooding. And then on top of that, they increase spending, but fail to prioritize people. $1.3 billion cut to education. We have 28,000 young people on a wait list, sometimes as long as 18 to 24 months. Failed to make the investments in closing the learning gap for our children in schools or reducing the wait times for youth accessing mental health services.
Peter Bethlenfalvy has called this budget Ontario's plan to build. But I want to put you two in charge now of giving your own title to what you'd call this thing. Okay, Alison, start us off. You'd call it what?
I mean, I'd call this budget a plan to win votes by any means necessary. We've already seen the PCs, use legislation to give themselves an advantage when it comes to fundraising, kind of to stifle critics leading up to the election by changing third-party advertising rules. And now it kind of seems like any fiscal bona fides they've had are out the window with, this rising deficit, post-COVID. And I think a lot of fiscal hawks might be asking for what? Why is the deficit going up again this year?
All interesting points, which we'll come back
to.
Right, I hear you. Okay, Matt, Peter Bethlenfalvy's calling it Ontario's plan to build. Matt Gurney's calling it what?
Highways. One word answer. Looking through this budget, it's highways. It's highways. It's highways. I was taking notes as I was reading through it. $150 billion in capital spending, and it's basically highways and other key infrastructure. And I actually look what the capital spending on. Not much of it's going to highways. I mean, we're spending almost like 2.5 times on transit what we're spending on highways. We're spending double on new hospital construction that we're spending on highways. But highways are what get the key billing in that part of the speech. look, this is politics. We got an election coming up. This is obviously a signal to the Premier's key voters that he's a guy who likes to get in his car and drive on highways and drive across bridges, and we're going to make new bridges, and we're going to rehabilitate other bridges for highways. Once I noticed it in the budget, and I just kept reading and reading and reading, I just found myself laughing at how many times it's just highways, even though it's a tiny percent of the actual capital spending.
This is, again, a simple reflection of how much people pay in taxes and the value of what they get back in services and whether they're putting more in or getting more out. So, Sheldon, the 6.5 million families that Peter Weltman just referred to, this is for the fiscal year 2019-2020, so before the pandemic hit. People paid to Ontario in taxes a little over $23,000 on average. They received from Ontario in services a little over $24,000 in average. So the net benefit for the average Ontarian was $846 to the plus. So on average, we get more out than we put in. Yes?
That's exactly right. And in fact, the first 6 income deciles, if you will, are net beneficiaries. The next 2 are neutral, if you like. They put in about the same amount as they get out. And the top 2 income deciles put in more than they get back in the value of services. So these are averages, important to keep in mind. Every individual circumstance is going to be different. So if you have people in your family who are very sick, for example, and they're spending a lot of time in hospital or wherever, they're using up and getting a lot of healthcare benefit, and vice versa.
And there will be some people who won't have to go to the hospital
for a very long time.
Yeah, for a very long
hopefully.
time.
Yep.
Well, let's just amplify on what you just said there. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up board 2 here, because remember, we're looking at 6.5 million families in the province of Ontario. 3.9 million families will be net beneficiaries. That's 60% of the families in the province of Ontario get more back in services than they put in taxes. 1.3 million families, it's neutral. Essentially, it's a wash. They put in, they take out, it's about the same amount. 1.3 million families are net contributors. Again, 20% of families put more in than they take out. What do you infer from the way that breaks down?
Well, it makes sense to a large degree. As I said before, most government programs are geared towards helping those who are lower income, who are disadvantaged in some way. So for example, things like housing affordability, a lot of that benefit is on the lower income side of things. Things like healthcare, though, are interesting. That distribution is fairly even right across all income deciles. So this is something, this sort of result we would expect. I wasn't expecting the 60% number to be quite as high as it is. I wasn't expecting the neutral side to be as wide as it was. And certainly I think I was expecting on the higher side to see there as net contributors.
Does this suggest, Peter, that if 60% of the people are taking out more than they're putting in, and for 20 it's a wash, that essentially that higher income earning 20% are floating pretty much everybody?
Yes, that's exactly right. And you'll see that in most places that have a progressive tax system.
Racism and sexism, for example, are system problems, and we've got to help leaders become system thinkers. And that's developing pattern recognition skills. And I would suggest that 360 hours is a good benchmark to start with.
All right, let's survey your colleagues here on the program tonight and see what they think about workplace mandated diversity and inclusion training. Kathy, you want to start us off? What's your view on it?
You know, I think I'm going to use the analogy Shaquille just used. I think it is not the problem of literacy, EDI literacy. I really think it is literacy and that workplace training is not the outcome. There must be more. Why folks would say it's not working is simply that we do training and then what? So there are a lot of folks who know how to write well. And then what? What do you do with writing well? So we must be doing more than merely workplace training. We've trained people to be great racists. We've given them great language for racism to use it as tools in their racist in continuing racism. And so I think it is literacy and then.
All right. Thank you, Kathy. Crystal, would you follow up? Workplace mandated training. What's your view?
Yeah, I would say that if we are training once a year, of course, that's not going to be effective. Diversity and inclusion is a lifelong journey. It's a process. And being one of the most diverse countries, cities, you can't travel to every country in 1 year. It's ongoing. And so to be effective, we need to do as much storytelling. That always on approach that my colleague just mentioned, of course, needs to take place. It's when we have strong understanding of one another and take that time to really learn, that's when we'll see true success.
Joshua, your view.
I think the mandated training provides a good starting point for conversation and discussion, but it needs to foreshadow some bigger changes to follow. And so to the and then question, we need to think about how diversity and inclusion training is reflective of broader organizational cultural shifts that are to follow. So employees, workers know how they can use the language, how they can use the concepts that they're learning about in the session in a meaningful way.
If morality were a larger part of the thinking of countries in the region, what would you like to see happen?
Well, I would like to see a more unified response, right? So not as many countries abstaining from these resolutions, but rather voting along with the West and condemning Russia. When we see the evidence coming out, the various investigations taking place in Ukraine of crimes against humanity committed by Russian military, it's very hard to see ambiguity in this conflict. And I think the problem is that for different reasons, many countries see this as a proxy war of Russia against the United States, not Russia against Ukraine. And in this context, that's a misinterpretation, right? It is a war between Russia and Ukraine, even though other powers have great influence over this conflict. Russia and Ukraine are the ones fighting this war. And I think that's something that gets lost sometimes in the discourse about moral ambiguity in this conflict.
Besma, would you like to see morality playing a larger role in the thinking of countries that so far have been on the fence?
Well, I'd like to see more of a humanist approach. I mean, picking up on what Maria said, I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is the challenge. And in some way, it's almost reflexive, it seems. Many of the southern countries are seeing this as though it's back to 1991 with Iraq. I mean, the same narrative is being pushed that somehow this is about regime change, that the Russians are trying to prevent. I mean, it's absolutely absurd when you see this naked aggression of the Russians against the Ukrainian people. It's horrific. But, it's somehow very easy to go back to these frames of this is a war between, two superpowers, the West and the East, again, the U.S. and the Russians. And let's not forget, I mean, this is really the Russian propaganda and disinformation that's out there.
Can I follow up with you, Rajan, in this regard? I suspect there are many Americans who would say, we understand your point, but that was the George W. Bush administration that brought in the notion of preventive war and torture and waterboarding and so on. And we have a different administration in place right now, and it is a very different administration that follows very different values. And therefore, don't obsess about what happened, 30 years ago, or with George Bush the father, or 15 years ago with George Bush the son. Focus on what's going on right now with this administration. Does that argument carry any water in your view?
Not with me. I don't think the Biden administration is some rarefied species that only acts on the basis of values and not interest. There are several occasions just since President Biden took over where allies or friends of the United States have engaged in practices that in no way comport with international human rights law, but haven't been condemned. And I'm not faulting the Biden administration for this, least of all demonizing the United States. It is simply a fact that international politics is a very difficult combination of trying to reconcile morality with interest. And when the two are in collision, alas, sometimes morality gives way. I wish it were not that way, but what I think doesn't matter.
Sumit, we haven't heard from you yet on this issue. Why don't you weigh in?
Well, to begin with, let me concur with something that Raj said about India. I can't speak for China. I don't follow the Chinese media with any care, but I do follow the Indian media. And I think despite the populism that Prime Minister Modi has promoted and has sought to shut down dissenting voices, I think there is still ample scope for dissent in India. And I don't think everybody is marching in lockstep with the government's view about Ukraine. I think there have been ample Indian intellectuals and social activists who have spoken out with considerable vigor, some of whom I know personally not to be overly self-referential. And there have been, I think, elements of attempts by Russia to spread disinformation in India, to use Lenin's famous term, through a bunch of useful idiots. That does exist. But I don't think there is a monolithic view by any standard in India. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second is that the Indians are really caught in a cleft stick. And bear in mind that in a week, Western Europe, particularly Germany, imports more oil from and natural gas from Russia than India does in an entire year. So it's easy to grandstand about morality and talk about how the Indians constitute an outlier when you have one of the most wealthy and powerful countries in Europe acutely dependent on Russian gas and petroleum.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvO.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's all for this Friday, April 29th, 2022. Monday, we'll try to understand why, despite being exposed to COVID-19, some people don't get sick. And Jayan Jagannathan talks to former Raptor Muggsy Bogues about making space for small ball in professional basketball. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend. And Jayan, we'll see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.
I'm traveling the world, exploring secrets and wonders. An adventure of discovery to try to understand the story of humanity.
Join Bettany Hughes as she reveals the story of humanity through its most remarkable treasures.
I'm taking you to my hand-picked wonders.
From the glories of ancient Greece to the fortresses of Malta. From Gibraltar to the islands of the Mediterranean. From Istanbul to the sands of Arabia.
Come with me to discover how the past shapes our lives.
Treasures with Bettany Hughes continues Monday at 7 on TVO.
My name is Jake Epstein, and my show Boy Falls from the Sky is all about the life of a Broadway performer.
I'm going to be in Spider-Man the Musical on Broadway. Do you have life insurance?
It's full of songs and stories.
The director comes up to me and asks me why I took this part if I couldn't dance. So I ask her why she offered me this part without making sure I could dance. She fires me on the spot.
Now playing at the Royal Alex Theatre from April 19th to May 29th.
為了散發的逼迫和未來的幸福促想。
This is my dad's private journal. It's called A Brief Record of My Time at Sea.
Join filmmaker Jeanette Kong as she recounts her father's immigration journey through his own words.
That very act of moving changed the course of my life, even though I wasn't born yet. It split our families into two